You're listening to Watchmen on the Pod. We're going to continue in our book reading. Can It Happen Again? Chronicles of the Holocaust. And this is a compilation, a book. It was edited by Roselle K. Chartock and Jack Spencer. And it's like a group of articles, people that had family in the camps or people that escaped Hitler in Germany during this time, and just a whole bunch of people. So here we go. This is part one. Oh, goodness gracious. B, which is going to be the end of part one, and then next time we'll pick up in part two. We escaped from Germany's Hitler. Catherine Noreen. I am a member of a very large German family. On my mother's side alone, there are 30 first cousins. Her mother was one of 8 children. Her father was one of 10 children. My mother's family name is Wallach. The Wallachs in Germany have been traced back to the 14th century. There are almost no members of my family left in Germany now. They were all driven out by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi before the Second World War. Those who did not escape from Germany died in concentration camps. The camps were part of Hitler's final solution, his plan to murder all the Jews in every land he took over. Many members of my family did escape. They now live all over the world, in the U.S., Africa, South America, Israel, France, and other nations. For 9 years after we left Germany, my parents, my sister, and I lived in Australia. Hitler moves to our town. In 1918, Adolf Hitler was 29 years old. That year, he moved to Munich. Munich was the home of my grandparents and their 4 children, my mother, my aunt, and my 2 uncles. Germany was in a real mess. World War I had just ended. The German government was all in confusion. The people were hungry. The land had been ruined by the war. Even if you had money, there was little to buy. It was the perfect time for a strong man to step in and take over the country. When Hitler started the Nazi Party in Munich in 1920, it had only 7 members. If they were alive today, they would be thought of as the worst kind of vagrants. Hitler himself was a school dropout. He spent his teen years wandering the streets in Vienna, Austria. He slept in flop houses and did odd jobs from time to time. Once in a while, he sold a painting or two. He thought himself an artist, but he had little talent. Hitler, with his tiny Nazi party, had dreams of power. He decided to take over the government in the state of Bavaria in 1923. His idea was to capture 50 important businessmen and city leaders as hostages. He would threaten them with death if the government was not handed over to him. My grandfather was to be taken as one of Hitler's hostages. My uncle Rolf remembers that day very clearly. This is how he described it to me recently. It was November 8th, 1923. First, the Nazis took one of the Bavarian leaders at gunpoint. They made him agree to work with them in the new government they were setting up. At 9 in the morning, they sent out groups of men to capture 50 hostages. They knew exactly who they wanted, and they sent 3 or 4 men to capture each one. I was in school that day, high school. They let the whole school out at 11. We were told not to go into the city, but to go straight home. When I got home, a Nazi stormtrooper opened the door for me. He had our maid and the mailman in the kitchen. Anybody who came to the door was put into the kitchen so they couldn't warn my father. They had sent people to our apartment and to our father's business. After 15 minutes, the phone rang. The stormtrooper took the call. After a while, he told us we could go. They had captured my father at his business. Mother and a friend of hers were walking down the street. They saw people being taken away. They didn't know what was going on. They didn't know that father had been captured until they got home. After the Nazis had all their hostages, they marched into the city, where they were met by the police. The police gave orders to halt, but the Nazis didn't halt. Shots rang out, and 19 people, 13 Nazis, 3 policemen, 3 bystanders were killed. Hitler threw himself to the ground with the shooting started and then escaped. The police then went and released the hostages. Father was home again by 5 o'clock. What would have happened if Hitler was successful? I don't know, but it was the whole thing lasted only half a day. But as it was, the whole thing lasted only half a day. 2 days later, Hitler was found hiding in a cupboard at a friend's home. He was arrested and sent to prison. Hitler was in jail. He wrote a book called Mein Kampf, My Struggle. In it, he wrote of his plans to take over the whole German government. He wrote about his hatred of democracy and his hatred of the Jews. He wrote that the Aryans, white non-Jewish people, were the master race of the world. He wrote that he would lead Germany and make it the greatest empire in the world. Hitler was released from jail in 1924. The Nazi Party grew larger and stronger. In 1933, less than 10 years after his first takeover attempt, Hitler was named Chancellor of all of Germany. As soon as he became Chancellor, he started to introduce some of the things he had written about in Mein Kampf. Only half a block away. My parents and their 4 children lived only half a block from Hitler in Munich. My aunt Anneliese, one of the 4 children, told me I used to walk home from school. Every once in a while, Hitler and a group of people passed by in their car. They would honk the horn. Everybody on the sidewalk would stop and salute. Of course, I wouldn't do that. It was quite uncomfortable living so close to him. Anneliese was in junior high during the early 1930s. I asked her whether the hatred of the Jews could be found in the schools as well as the government. She said that it depended which school you went to and who the teachers were. I had only one bad experience, she told me. It was with my gym teacher, who was a real Nazi. I had a friend in that class who was also Jewish. She and I were the best in the gym class, and the teacher was always yelling at the rest of the class, saying, "You lazy girls, how can you let those 2 Jew girls be better than you?" One of the Nazi laws was that Aryans were not allowed to date Jews. When Anneliese was in school, she had a non Jewish boyfriend. Wherever they went, they were always scared that they would be caught. One day, as they were crossing a big square near grandparents' house, a policeman called over her. How this is it? Oh, this is it, she thought. Now they've got me. She walked up to the policeman. "You shouldn't walk on the grass," he said. You should walk around the square. A stormtrooper knocks. Hitler and the Nazis began to make things very rough for the Jews. My grandfather, was in trouble because of the work he did. My grandfather was born in a small town in the north of Germany. As he and his brother grew up, they saw that many of the peasant folk traditions of Germany were dying out. As women left their homes and went to work in city factories, they threw away their peasant costumes. Every area of Germany had its own native dress, but this clothing was being forgotten as people wanted to look more modern and sophisticated. My grandfather and his brother decided to save these dying traditions. They opened a folk museum in Munich. The museum had 42 rooms. Each room was designed and decorated with traditional native furniture and folk art at a different area of a different area. Because of this museum, my grandfather was a target for the Nazis. Hitler also wanted to bring back the clothes, furniture, and art of the past. He hated the idea of Jewish people owning this museum. So the Nazis wanted to get their hands on my grandfather's business. They wanted his collections, his furniture, and his art. One day in 1937, a Nazi stormtrooper knocked on my grandparents' door. My grandmother answered and asked what he wanted. "I am here to take away all of your cultural objects," he said. "Is there anything you would like to keep? Is there anything that you particularly love that you would like to save?" "Yes," my grandmother said. "I want to save these antique pewter containers. I'm saving them for my son Rolf." The pewter containers were the first things that the Nazis took. He had just wanted to find out what my grandmother treasured the most so he could be sure and take them. He took a great many other things as well. My grandparents were among hundreds of thousands of people robbed by the Nazis. During the war, the Nazis stole art treasures from all over Europe. They stashed their loot away in caves and other hiding places. They planned to unpack and enjoy them once they had won the war. After the war, U.S. and Allied soldiers found these hidden treasures. One of the crates they found was labeled with my grandfather's name, Wallach. They wrote to my grandfather and asked him to list everything the Nazis had taken from him. He sent them the list. All the stolen property was in the crate, including the pewter containers. My Uncle Ralph got the containers after all. They are now in his living room in Connecticut. I photographed them a few weeks ago. Crystal Night. In the late 1930s, the Nazis started to take over all businesses owned by Jewish people. In 1937, an antique dealer named Witt came to see my grandfather. He offered to buy my grandfather's business, but my grandfather said no. The next year, Mr. Witt came again. This time, his offer was not an offer at all, it was a threat. Things had changed. This is what happened. On November 8th, a German embassy worker was shot and killed by a Jewish man who hated the Nazis. As revenge, during the next 3 days, the windows of Jewish stores and synagogues all over Germany were smashed. Thousands of Jewish men and boys were rounded up and thrown into concentration camps. Hitler now had the excuse he needed to start what he called the final solution, the murder of all Jews in Germany. This incident is known as Crystal Night. That's because of the sound of broken glass that was heard throughout the whole country that night. My father was one of the men thrown into jail that night, but he was lucky. He had some money on him. He used it to bribe the guard to let him out of his cell. A few days after Crystal Night, Witt came to see my grandfather. He told my grandfather that if he didn't sell, he would be thrown into a concentration camp. So my grandfather sold his business to Witt for a very small sum of money. He put the money in the bank. A few days later, the money was taken by the government. They said it was a tax for being able to leave the country. Getting out. Many Jewish people had already left Germany. My Uncle Rolf had left, but the rest of my family were still there. On Crystal Night, right after he was let out of his cell, my father went to the police. He told them that our family had visas to leave the country. He asked if we could go. I was a tiny baby at that time, and my sister Bridget was 4. We were given 10 days to get out of the country. 10 days later, we were on a boat to Australia. My grandparents did not have visas to leave. You had to have a visa from the country to which you wanted to go. They were not easy to get. Hundreds of thousands of people were trying to get out of Europe at that time. But my uncle Rolf had come to the US in 1928. He was already a US citizen and was able to get visas for my grandparents. Rolf had come to the US because he was angry. He was 18 in 1928. He had been invited to sit in on my grandfather's business meetings. At this very meeting, he opened his mouth to say something, and my grandfather told him to be quiet. Rolf sat silently until the meeting was over. Then he walked out of the room and went to the American consulate. He applied for a visa to the U.S. A few weeks later, he sailed to America. Rolf's falling out with my grandfather turned out to be very lucky. By 1938, he was a U.S. citizen, and he had enough money to be able to sponsor my grandparents, my Uncle Fritz, my Aunt Annalise, and 6 other members of the family. There is a bee that somehow just made its way in my room. Hopefully to stay over there until I'm done. Some of my grandparents' sisters and brothers could not get out, though. They couldn't find a sponsor. Rolf was allowed to sponsor only 10 people, and they didn't have enough money to buy their way out. These people, some of my great aunts and uncles, and some of their children died in Hitler's concentration camps. This has been one of the great sadnesses of my family's life. A new life. If my grandfather had been paid fairly for his business, he would have been able to get the rest of the family out of Germany, but he was not. He and my grandfather arrived in New York in 1939 with 10 marks, $2.50 in U.S. money in their pockets. My grandparents were starting a new life in New York, and my parents, my sister, and I were doing the same in Australia. For the last year of our stay in Australia, I went to public school in Melbourne. The school was very old-fashioned. If you did something wrong or didn't do your homework, the teachers would hit you. The girls were hit with a ruler. The boys got the strap. We used to get rapped over the knuckles for every spelling word we got wrong. To this day, I'm a very good speller. I love to draw, and I was always drawing in class. The teacher warned me several times to stop, but one day a friend asked me to draw a picture of her. Needless to say, I was caught. The teacher called me up to the front of the desk. I was hit 10 times across the back of my knee with a ruler. Then I went to stand in the corner with a dunce cap on my head. I stood there facing the wall, and tears dripped down my face. All over the world, the war was going on and people were suffering and dying. But this day in class in Melbourne is one of the most vivid memories from that time. I will also never forget how happy we were all the day the war ended. We were all set to sail for the US. It was very exciting. The journey from Melbourne to New York took 6 weeks. When we finally arrived, there at the pier waiting for us were my grandparents, my Uncle Rolf, my Uncle Fritz, and my Aunt Annalise. We were a family again. In 1943, Ellie Wiesel was a El, Eli Wiesel was a boy living in the village of Sziget in a mountainous region of Hungary. The war had barely touched his remote settlement. The radio was their sole source of information about the fighting. In his novel, Night, Wes Wiesel related how one day all non-Hungarians were expelled from the town. His beloved teacher, Moish, Moshi, the Bedel, was among those rounded up and deported. Listen to me, Eli Wessel. Yeah, that is a B. You know what? I'm going to stop this. I'm going to pick up here in a few minutes. I have got to get rid of that B. I am allergic and I really don't want to be stung. Okay. I will pick it up here in a few minutes, brothers and sisters. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Always. Your nose in the book. Oh, and in bed, which is the Word of God. And embed the Word of God upon the tablets of your hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. Okay. I love you. Bye-bye.